A common way to begin a lecture series with the title Introduction to is to spend a few throat-clearing minutes defining what the thing is that you're going to introduce. So it's not unreasonable that at the beginning of an Introduction to Sociology lecture, you would expect me to tell you what this thing called sociology is. But I'm not going to do that, or at least I'm not going to do it directly. Instead, what I'm eventually going to do is what Anton Chekhov recommended writers of fiction do, which is to try to show rather than tell. The reason I'm going to take this indirect approach is because, and now for a trigger warning, I'm going to say something that may shock you. Coming up with a straightforward, snappy definition of sociology is a completely futile, hopeless task, which is beyond me. A few brave souls have in fact written books with the title "What is Sociology?" or similar, but these tend either to pose the question without actually answering it, or tell you what it isn't, or present a wholly idiosyncratic personal vision of what the enterprise should be. The basic problem is that sociology, as it actually exists, institutionalized in university departments and academic journals, is a discipline of low disciplinarity. Inconvenient as it might be, there is not one sociology. There are many sociologies. If you were to travel the length and breadth of the land and visit all the sociology departments in the UK, you would find courses in different places with reassuringly similar names. But on examining the content of the courses, you would find that actually they didn't have very much in common. Choose 10 sociologists at random and you'll get 10 different opinions about what the important sociological questions are, about what is known and what is unknown, about what is interesting and what is completely uninteresting, and perhaps most importantly, about how one should go about doing whatever sociology is. This sounds bad, but there is worse. Consider anthropology. It's a different subject, right? Well, only partly. Sociology and anthropology have common intellectual ancestors, but somewhat different histories, and became institutionalized in different departments. They certainly originally focused on different kinds of societies, and that in itself led to a preoccupation with slightly different sorts of questions. But today, I have the impression that anthropologists are as likely to be interested in Western Europe as they are in South Sudan or Melanesia. Kate Fox's Watching the English, The Hidden Rules of English Behaviour, is called a work of anthropology, but could just as easily be labelled sociology. Likewise, my colleague Heather Hamill's The Hoods, an investigation of the policing of juvenile delinquency by paramilitaries in West Belfast, is nominally a work of sociology, but could, without any significant change, be labelled an anthropological text. In short, trying to identify sociology by observing what everything currently called sociology, or all the people who are currently called sociologists, have in common will not get you very far, or more precisely, will just lead you to banalities such as "it's the study of society" or "it's whatever sociologists do." We also won't get far by attempting to distinguish sociology's current core intellectual content from that of some of its core or close relatives. A more illuminating approach is to think along the following lines. First, ask yourself, what, in rather general terms, are all the social sciences trying to do? Then, ask what particular perspectives those calling themselves sociologists have contributed to this. At the most general, abstract level, most of the social sciences have at their core what is sometimes called the Hobbesian question, after Thomas Hobbes, the English political philosopher. Why is there order rather than disorder? How is that order brought about and maintained? And under what circumstances does it break down? The precise terminology may differ. Some may talk about achieving coordination, others about market equilibrium, others still about group solidarity. To be sure, the details will differ, but the core idea is the same. How do people align their actions and forbearances in order to produce something together that they value and that they couldn't produce solely on their own? In a way, it's analogous to the headline I saw recently in my daughter's New Scientist, which went, "Why is there something rather than nothing?" The answers and the kinds of coordination problems investigated, of course, differ between the social scientific disciplines. Markets and prices, altruism, emotional attachment, selective incentives, rules and norms, political power, and ultimately the threat or use of sanctions and violence are some of the main ingredients. But which of these mechanisms comes to the fore and dominates other solutions under which circumstances? That is a question that fuels a large proportion of social scientific research. Consider an example which is literally about the production of order and predictability. When and where does the mafia or mafia-like organizations emerge and thrive? The answer is typically where the power of the state to enforce order and predictability in social and economic relationships is weak, non-existent, or has broken down. The state of affairs, it should be said, that mafia-like organizations have an interest in perpetuating. Protection and the enforcement of order is right up there along with all the other products that mafias are in the business of selling. Nice little restaurant you have here. Shame if anything happened to it. For a small monthly payment, we can help you with that. Once people know we are on your side, you and your family will have no bother, and you'll be free to go about your business. Just remember who your friends are. Or consider a more abstract problem. You own a factory that produces widgets. People want to buy them, but you can't produce them on your own. You have to get other people to help you with the production. But what would be the best way to organize this? Should you have a lineup outside the factory gate each morning and accept competitive bids from individual workers for the right to do an 8-hour shift? Should you offer people a contract of employment for an extended period of time that defines reciprocal rights and obligations? Should you subcontract the business of producing widgets to an agent who will agree for a set price to use your machinery and undertakes to provide and pay workers to do it? All of these arrangements and very many more have been tried at various times, all with the objective of coordinating the joint production of something or other. But which is best? Under what circumstances is one superior to another? How did we end up with jobs and contracts of employment as we understand them today? Indeed, how did we end up with the idea of organizations with real legal identities that are independent of the human individuals that work in them, and that can do things like borrow money, employ workers, or be sued? These, and many others, are the sorts of questions that are common to the social sciences. But what about sociology? Writing in the 1920s in an essay with the title Mr. Bennett and Mrs. Brown, Virginia Woolf makes the following observation. On or about December 1910, human character changed. All human relations have shifted, those between masters and servants, husbands and wives, parents and children, and when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. Let us agree to place one of these changes about the year 1910. What she has in mind is modernism, or more precisely the impact of modernism on the aesthetic and ethical sensibilities of a small group of English intellectuals, mostly her personal friends and relations, in fact. For her, the event that allegedly shocked them out of their slumber was Roger Fry's 1910 Manet and the Post-Impressionist exhibition at London's Grafton Gallery, the exhibition that first brought Gauguin, Cézanne, Matisse and Van Gogh to the attention of the English public. We shouldn't take Virginia Woolf's precise claims too seriously. Most of the world carried on as normal and cared not a jot for the Post-Impressionists. To the woman on top of the proverbial Clapham omnibus, January 1911 looked much like December 1910. But as she sees it, something important had changed in the way people of discernment, like herself, viewed the world, and after that, there was no going back. For the early sociologists, many of whom, by the way, would not have used that term to describe themselves, it wasn't a single, precisely timed event comparable to the Fry exhibition that focused their thoughts about social change. Nevertheless, it is obvious that they were all in some sense influenced by the consequences of two momentous sets of social, economic and political changes that defined the modern world. Those set in train by the Industrial Revolution and those that flowed from the French Revolution and the eventual reaction to it. It is no exaggeration to say that in one way or another, the varied intellectual projects of Karl Marx, Auguste Comte, Alexis de Tocqueville, Ferdinand Tönnies, Emil Durkheim, Max Weber, and Vilfredo Pareto had one thing in common, and that was the attempt to make sense of what seemed to them to be a rapidly changing modern world that was so obviously qualitatively different from the kind of world their parents or grandparents had grown up in. How they described those differences, the weight that they gave to different aspects of the changes they saw around them, the precise concepts they coined or invoked to explain them, of course varied. It's not possible here to give an account of how all these particular thinkers interpreted the processes of historical change that they thought these two great events set in train. Instead, what I want to do is outline some of the key distinctions that informed their visions and had lasting consequences for the vocabulary that succeeding generations of sociologists up to the present day still employ. To do this, I'm going to rather shamelessly steal some of the organising framework of Robert Nisbet's book, The Sociological Tradition, which sets out what he called sociology's key unit ideas in the form of pairs of contrasts. These are community and society, authority and power, status and class, and the sacred and the secular. And I'm going to talk and discuss about each one of these in turn. First of all, community and society. At heart, the nature of this distinction is the nature of the social bond or relation that ties people together. Unless one is using the word for purely rhetorical purposes as a sort of shorthand or pointer, for example in phrases like the black community or the Asian community or the Jewish community, community usually has connotations of the small scale, the intimate, the face-to-face. The prototypical unit is probably the family or kinship group. Family members have common interests in survival, reproduction, and to varying degrees the welfare of the family members. The common objectives or goals of families beyond that may well be rather diffuse and intangible, but whatever they are the product of coordinated actions and forbearances by the kinship group. One can see this much more clearly in ages past, when families or households consisting of kin were the basic unit of economic production, and what was primarily being produced was the basic means of survival, food and protection from the natural and human environment. The idea of community tends to have rather positive connotations for us. It's suggestive of personal ties between people, perhaps regulated more by custom, or at least by rather diffuse and not particularly instrumental principles of exchange. We're supposed to love our parents, our siblings, and to a lesser degree more distant kin and neighbours, not for instrumental reasons, or because if we scratch their backs they will reciprocate by scratching ours, but because it is the right and proper thing to do. Offering a direct payment to a parent, a relative, or a close friend for doing the sort of things that parents, relatives, or friends do for each other would, as likely as not, be regarded as odd, if not downright insulting. Relations between people in a community have continuity and depth. They tend to be multi-purpose rather than highly specific. They treat people as ends rather than means. All this is highly idealized. No historical or contemporary community will match this description. Not all families, let alone all communities, are happy places to inhabit. However, putting things in this way helps us to draw a contrast with another way of characterizing social relations. Society, what the early sociologists either abhorred as a threat or welcomed as a liberation from community, is an entirely different kettle of fish. To talk about society is to emphasize social relations that are short-term, highly specific in their purpose, can be broken at will, are instrumental in their intent, are actively chosen rather than just given or inherited, are relatively impersonal, are explicitly regulated by law rather than custom and work on a large rather than an intimate scale. When I buy my groceries in Sainsbury's, I don't think the cashier's inquiry as to how I am today is an invitation to pour out my woes. I know that this is just a polite formula to grease the wheels of an entirely instrumental transaction. I want to eat, I load up my trolley, I put the items on the conveyor band, and she puts them through the till. Likewise, I don't regard my lawyer or the man who repairs my car as a personal friend who I can chat to about a wide range of issues. A society is a world of specific purposes and contractual relationships. My interest in you is whether you can do for me what you say you can do and how much it's going to cost me. My attitude towards you is calculative. I don't particularly care whether my baker is a morally good person, a Muslim, a Hindu, or a Jew. What I care about is whether they bake good bread. Communal relationships may succor the individuals enmeshed in them, or they may smother them. Societal relationships may liberate individuals. People left their villages not just because of economic necessity, but to be free of the twitching curtains. But they may also lead to a feeling of rootlessness, an alienation from one's neighbours, and ultimately a lack of social solidarity with those one has fleeting contact with. Instrumental relations may lead to efficiency, but it is a thin sort of life, devoid of the savour that makes life worth living. A theme that runs through most of Émile Durkheim's work is the growth of, as he saw it, a corrosive societal individualism. He went as far as to call it the cult of individualism, and he felt this was beginning to destroy many of the valuable social bonds that tie people together. This particular line of thought has been taken up by people like George Brown in his work on the social origins of depression, and Robert Putnam on social capital and the decline of civil society as reflected in membership of voluntary associations. Authority and power. Using naked force to coordinate activity is certainly possible. Do it because I or my agents have the power to make you, even if you don't want to, is the prerogative of states and the modus operandi of slaveholders and feudal lords. And we shouldn't forget, it can also be the modus operandi in kinship groups, particularly when the threat of force is applied to women and children. Pyramids were built by physically coerced labour, and slaves picked cotton in the southern states. The story of the building of a modern state is partly the story of the processes by which the state gradually reserved to itself a monopoly of the legitimate use of violence and physical coercion, and takes away from private citizens the ability and the rights to use it. But having a monopoly of the means to force people to do your bidding is rarely an efficient and sustainable way of getting things done or keeping the peace. It's much better if people believe that whatever orders you give are in some sense legitimate. That is, you have the right to give them, and their recipients feel they have an obligation to carry them out. So the question becomes not whether you have the naked power to enforce your will, but what sources of authority can you deploy? If you can persuade people that acting in a certain way is their duty, then you have no need to show them the iron fist. Even better, if you don't need to persuade them, but they internalize the reigning principles of authority with their mother's milk, so that it becomes a deep-seated part of the way they see the natural order of the world. There are lots of ways of doing it, some very ancient. Among the oldest legitimizing tactics is some sort of appeal to patriarchal authority, for example, the Roman patrus familias. Your father is the head of the house, the only person with full civil and political rights, and thus he gets to call the shots, and everyone else is obliged to feel that he has a perfect right to do so. The underpinnings of this may ultimately be religious. It would be unpious not to feel that way, but this is reinforced in law. The idea, of course, is that the father acts in the best interests of the family as he sees it, not that he acts in his own interests. The principle is readily extendable. The medieval tradesman took his apprentices into his own household and, acting in loco parentis, dispensed justice according to the rules of tradition, which in effect were the rules of the house binding each apprentice to his master. The master of a small 19th century workshop would often employ a small cadre of workers, loyal to the owner and his family, and would exercise personal authority over them. Elements of paternalism entered into the otherwise hard-nosed operations of large corporations. When I was growing up in Coventry, all the car factories had their own sports grounds, social clubs, golf courses, and leisure clubs for their workers. The Standard factory even had its own pipe band. Another obvious source of legitimacy is tradition. We do things this way, and it's right that we do things in this way, because that's how we've always done it from time immemorial. Of course, it turns out that traditions often do have definite beginnings, and sometimes turn out not to be very traditional. Walter Scott more or less invented the tradition of traditional clan tartans on the occasion of a royal visit to Scotland. Imagined communities and imagined traditions are very much a thing and require work to make them established. Another aspect of traditional authority relations is charisma. Authority can be considered legitimate because of the personal qualities of a leader, or because they or their ancestors are believed to have been touched by or received some sort of divine preference. The Japanese emperor was a god. European monarchs reigned by divine right and were thought to have had special supernatural powers. The king's touch as a cure for disease was practiced by both the English and the French monarchies, and only permanently abandoned in England at the beginning of the reign of George I. Hebrew prophets were honoured and listened to because, it was thought, they had a direct line to God. Charismatic leadership can be a force for good, getting people to do things they thought were impossible, and also a source of unrestrained evil and disaster. If the leadership is successful, there comes a time when the question of succession arises, and that almost always poses a problem. How does one routinize the legitimacy that charisma gave to a popular authority figure? Oliver Cromwell was undoubtedly, at least for a time, a charismatic leader. His son, Richard, who succeeded him, was not. Somehow, the charisma had leaked away, and Charles II was the eventual beneficiary. In these circumstances, a great deal of interest tends to develop, especially in religious organizations, about the directness of the connection to the original charismatic figure. How close is the current incumbent to the direct line of descent? This might literally be a matter of biological descent, or simply occupying the shoes, so to speak, in an unbroken line, like the Catholic Pope. Having an unbroken connection can to some extent, and in some eyes, compensate for a lack of some of the desirable personal characteristics of a leader. However, charismatic authority very often fails to travel unless you can establish a church in which the charismatic authority of the foundation figure transmutes into the bureaucratized authority of an organization. The idea of legitimate authority being conferred by acting in accordance with non-arbitrary rules and procedures is fundamental to most modern societies. The computer says no is the reductio ad absurdum of the idea that legitimacy requires personal discretion to be minimized. Bureaucrats have powers as prescribed by the rules and no powers that extend beyond the rules. People expect to be governed by the rules and nothing but the rules. Decisions must be justified according to publicly available principles and codes of conduct, and there is a presumption that people will be treated either equally or strictly in accordance with characteristics that are relevant to the question under consideration. An equally important source of legitimate authority in modern societies is democratic accountability. Discussing what that should and does mean in practice would be the subject of a whole lecture series, so I'm not going to dwell on it now. However, I will point out that one of the classics of 19th century sociological writing is de Tocqueville's 2 volumes on democracy in America, in which he contrasts the old world and the new with respect to the influence of the idea of egalitarian democracy on civil society, culture, and politics, and while fascinated by the American experiment, finds many grounds for pessimism about how it will turn out. The sociological study of power and authority relations has long been a staple of the literature. How do public and private bureaucracies actually work to achieve their ends? How did mass politics come to be organized in terms of political parties? Why is there a tension between within-party democracy and electoral success? Why do people vote or participate in politics at all, given that their vote almost never counts? And how, when they do they make their minds up about who to vote for? All of these form part of the research agenda of political sociologists. I'll now turn to status and class. All societies but the most primitive have some sort of division of labour, and out of that, more or less invariably, distinctions that can be thought of as hierarchical. How these distinctions should be thought about was a major preoccupation of the early sociologists, and still provides a rich source of questions. We can think about 2 different ways in which such hierarchical distinctions might be organised, and both may be present to greater or lesser degrees in different contemporary and historical societies. Status distinctions usually imply a social relation that is characterised by derogation and deference, acceptance or social closure. The high up look down on the lowly and do not accept them as social equals. They may avoid physical contact with them, refuse to share food with them, and rigorously enforce prohibitions against intermarriage. For their part, the lowly may vary in their attitude from resigned acceptance of the seemingly natural order of things to a sort of sullen resentment tempered by minimal adherence to the conventions of social deference. The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. The popular hymn conjures up images of the small-scale rural idyll of village society in which everyone knows their place and the squire and parson rule with a firm but kindly paternal authority that is sensitive to the obligations to the community that their respective positions entail. Of course, in practice, the reality might have been rather different. Contemporary developed societies are not of course, caste societies, and they're not small-scale societies where everyone knows their own place and can instantly recognise the place and standing of those they come into fleeting contact with. But status as a principle of social differentiation still seems to have some utility for organising our thoughts. Who marries whom and who chooses whom as a friend is partly a matter of availability, but also a matter of whom one chooses to accept. Despite modern democratic mores, birds of a feather still flock together, and in some cases adopt strategies that are in essence designed to keep outsiders firmly out. In-groups and out-groups are a persistent feature of adolescent society, even if the basis of inclusion and exclusion can seem to the adults in the room to look entirely arbitrary. People would be ashamed to use the vocabulary of social pollution, though it was still alive in Jane Austen's time, but the idea of not quite one of us is still very much alive today. The early sociologists were very much concerned with what they saw as a transition from a world dominated by well-understood status hierarchies to a world in which division according to social class was the leading principle. People left their small villages and towns with their stable relations of obligation and deference and found themselves in the fast-growing cities where nobody knew anyone but their neighbours and where they were nothing to their employer beyond the effort they exchanged for a cash wage, a mere entry in a profit and loss account. Relations of social class were something entirely different from relations of social status, though the latter might be overlaying over the former. The mill owner, who was himself apprenticed at 14, aspired to buy a country estate, send his son to Oxford, and have his daughters marry a lord. The word class came into increasingly common usage in the English language in the late 17th century, where its primary usage indicated a grouping of things that had something in common. The roots of this usage probably go back at least a century, when the Latin classis, indicating a division or grouping of the population with respect to property, was used primarily in writing about Roman history. Gradually, from the early 18th century onwards, class came to take its place alongside and eventually replace words like estate, degree, or rank to distinguish population groups with respect to social and economic characteristics. And what was the basis of this distinction? Primarily one that was rooted in property. Marx, in his abstract model of society, distinguished between those that owned productive capital and those that owned nothing but their labour power. To survive, the latter needed to exchange that for wages in order to buy their means of subsistence. This exchange of labour power for money was the part of the crude cash nexus that Marx saw as the rising, organising principle of a new sort of society. Industrial capitalism extended the dominion of the employment relationship wider and wider, so that that relationship came to dominate all others outside of the family circle. The sacred and the secular. A fundamental way in which almost all people have mapped the content of the world is to distinguish between the sacred and secular spheres. The secular, profane world is dominated by utilitarian doing and getting, while the sacred world is concerned with non-utilitarian, even non-rational matters. We often go to some lengths to keep the sacred and the secular, the pure and the impure, apart. Special days are set aside, special places are consecrated for the celebration of rituals. Some people are accorded a special aura and have specialized priestly functions. Some objects are accorded a special status, perhaps considered especially dangerous and forbidden, or to be treated and dealt with only in specially prescribed ways. The clean and the unclean are to be separated. Most cultures have their totems and their taboos. One does not swear in front of the bishop. One must remove one's hat in church if you're a gentleman, and not if you're a lady. One should genuflect in front of the cross, cross oneself in the appropriate way, say the appropriate words after you've received the host from the priest, observe the Sabbath, and keep it holy. Religion is a way of seeing the content of this world and speculating about worlds that we cannot see. It's also a source of group solidarity in a number of ways. Firstly, it's a belief system which binds people together, gives them a common way of understanding and relating to the world. Secondly, it brings people together on a regular basis to participate in ritual, and participating in ritual seems to give people a sense of communion and common belonging. We may believe that in our secular age, ritual is dead or dying, but what is the performance at the cenotaph, the minute's silence, taking the knee at sports events, singing the national anthem, or Abide With Me, and the cup final? It's ritual. Why is it done? Because people feel it's the right and appropriate thing to do. It's expressive and has no particularly well-defined instrumental purpose. Thirdly, religion in the form of churches and places of worship literally create group solidarity for the members by bringing them into regular close contact with each other and creating the occasions in which they can plan and put into action common enterprises. They may meet to worship on a Sunday, but on Monday they make a meal for the OAP club, on Tuesday they feed the homeless, on Wednesday they run the youth club, and so on. It is sometimes said that while the Church of England was the Conservative Party at prayer, the nonconformist churches were the schools of working class self-organisation. What I've tried to do today is not give a nice clear-cut definition of what sociology is. That, I think, is impossible. Instead, I've suggested that the sociological tradition emerged out of the reaction, both positive and negative, to profound social change in the 19th century. This can be most pithily summed up as responses to the changes set in train by the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. Thinking about this led to ways of seeing that were organised around some key distinctions that can be used both to understand societal development and also to understand heterogeneity in social relations and social behaviour within a society.